I mean, I agree that that's a danger and that there is something of a moral panic. Fake news in particular probably had a trivial role in the 2016 election.
Hello and welcome to Off Script. My name is Stephen Edgington. Do we live in an era of fake news and conspiracy theories? Is the world progressing or regressing? To answer these questions, I'm joined by the internationally best-selling author and psychologist, Steven Pinker, whose recent book on rationality is already making shockwaves in the academic world. What is rationality, and is it a popular concept today?
I define it as the use of knowledge to attain a goal. And so the particular variety of rationality that you might talk about depends on the goal. If it's to deduce true propositions from other true propositions, we call it logic. If it's to assess the propensity of an event to take place, we call it probability. There are other goals, such as calibrating degree of belief in a hypothesis according to evidence. That would be Bayesian reasoning. So there are a number of tools of rationality, but each of which is designed to attain a particular kind of goal. It has a bit of a reputation problem. I'm often asked, if you extol rationality, does that mean that I can't appreciate beauty, I can't fall in love, I can't dance, I can't have fun? And so there is an idea, probably going back to the Romantic movement, that being committed to rationality involves some kind of dour, joyless kind of existence, which does not follow. Rationality is a way of attaining a goal, and there's nothing to say that that goal can't be taking advantage of all the pleasures that are available to a human being.
So you're trying to make rationality sexy again?
I don't know if I'm the person to do that, but it would be good if someone did.
Are human beings rational?
We must have a capacity for rationality, otherwise we couldn't establish the benchmarks against which we can compare humans and even ask the question, are humans rational? Are humans what? Well, it's we humans who can stipulate or at least try to characterize what's rational. And in our day-to-day lives, in all cultures, people deploy rationality. That's what makes humans human. I start off the book with some vignettes about the San people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the world's oldest cultures. They're hunter-gatherers, and they depend on a lot of rationality to make it through the day and to stay alive. They engage in persistence hunting, which involves tracking an animal from the bits of evidence that it leaves behind. And they give all evidence of many kinds of rationality. They have a sense of probability, including a sense of conditional probability. That is, if the ground is soft and if it was this kind of animal, then it would leave behind this kind of hoofprint. They engage in critical thinking, so they learn to distrust their first impressions. They don't accept arguments from authority. If a tribal elder has a hypothesis about what animal left behind a track and a young upstart wants to challenge him, that's okay. They'll give him the floor. So in many ways, rationality is our birthright, and I emphasize that so that we don't have the excuse of kind of forgiving our own outbursts of irrationality by saying, oh, well, what can you expect? We descended from hunter-gatherers who had to always be on the lookout for a lion hiding in the grass in the savannah. We do have the capacity for reason. We don't always deploy it in pursuit of the goal of objective truth or best policies.
You follow on from rationality progress. Is that accurate?
Well, certainly the other way around is accurate, namely observing the facts of progress, as I have tried to do in previous books, Enlightenment Now and The Better Angels of Our Nature. It then raises the question, where did that progress come from? How did we manage to reduce famine and infant mortality and extreme poverty? They didn't decline by themselves. It was only the application of rationality with the goal of bettering humanity in one way or another, reducing disease, reducing war, reducing hunger, that we were able to push back against forces of nature that have no particular benevolent regard for our well-being.
Is rationality subjective to each individual? And something that's rational to me might seem completely irrational to you, and you've got to make a decision as to whether that is correct or not. And for example, many people believed in America that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were working together to somehow corrupt the 2016 campaign. That turned out to be a conspiracy theory. Not right. It was proven that there was no collusion, as it were. Those people were being irrational in retrospect, but they thought they were being rational at the time, and they believed in this conspiracy theory that was pumped out in the media in a huge way. So do you accept that rationality is subjective to each individual's purposes?
No, claims of rationality are subjective, but rationality virtually by definition is not subjective. So the fact that someone claims to be rational doesn't mean that they were. They could be mistaken in that claim. And in fact, most people who claim to be rational are mistaken, because none of us can really aspire to perfect rationality. I mean, we can aspire to it, but we can't attain it, is perhaps what I should say. So plenty of people, and even the mistaken belief that there was collusion between Trump and Putin, I don't think the word rationality appeared in all of those op-eds. There was an implicit, we all have an implicit commitment to rationality whenever we argue for anything being true. But it wasn't as if the people who had that mistaken beliefs actually said we're being rational, at least not that I remember.
The reason I bring it up is because I think it's one of those many conspiracy theories that have sprouted in recent years and perhaps been driven by the rise of social media, and you touch on this in your recent book. Has social media made people more rational or less rational? Well,
there's a lot of, let's say, diversity in rationality that social media have contributed to. Some people use it as a source of information and access to articles they might not otherwise come across. I mean, that's the way I try to use it. On the other hand, if it isn't used just as a link to properly vetted and high quality sources, if it's used as a repository of information in itself, then because it is not fact-checked, it's not vetted, it's not sat on while its sources are double-checked, then it can proliferate an awful lot of nonsense very quickly.
And linking in with that, the rise of the internet as a concept, not just social media, that's more of a recent thing, but the internet itself, it's enabled access to almost unlimited information to almost all human beings on the earth. If you've got access to a phone, then you've got access to the internet, and you've got access to an immense amount of information that wasn't available 20, 30 years ago. Are you surprised that that hasn't led to human beings becoming more rational and becoming almost perfectly rational when they've got access to all this information?
Yeah, I am surprised, and I had thought that just as the dissemination of affordable books had a role in and pamphlets had a role in the Enlightenment, that the easy access to information would lead to kind of a new Enlightenment. I think what I'd underestimated was the necessity of gatekeepers, of quality control, of fact-checking, the fact that our accomplishments of rationality really depend on this infrastructure of norms and institutions that make us collectively rational in a way that no individual is likely to be. That when it comes to individuals, we're often quite happy with comforting stories, with emboldening myths, with rumors that underscore how perfidious our enemies are and how glorious and noble and wise our own coalition is. And social media make that all too easy, that truth and, or at least our best claims to truth are kind of a rare and precious accomplishment that can only come about through communities that adhere to criteria that allow us to winnow out all of the many, many false ideas that occur to us and zero in on the true ones.
Social media itself may simply be a reflection of human nature in that sense. In that sense, it's not that surprising that on social media and the internet, when people have access to unlimited information almost, they choose the information that suits their own biases and their own beliefs already. And I know that you talk about rational decision making. It's more like kind of confirming your own views, and rather than looking at the evidence objectively, you want to find the evidence that supports your own analysis.
Exactly, and in fact that's exactly the way I would put it. And it's not an observation that you see in a lot of the condemnations of social media, where blamed on the nefarious chase after profits by Mark Zuckerberg and all the rest. And well, we kind of got what we wished for, and we were reminded of some of the darker sides of human nature, especially when it comes to kind of epistemic beliefs, and that, or beliefs I should just say, namely that the commitment to factual veracity is pretty compartmentalized. When it comes to whether there's enough gas in the car to get us to the city we want, people are pretty rational. They don't engage in wishful thinking or propaganda or fake news. They really got to know. But when it comes to the public sphere, where an individual person's opinion, in most cases, has a trifling impact. I mean, who cares what I think about climate change? It's not going to change the climate. And so my belief is kind of I have the luxury of endorsing beliefs that will increase my status within my clique, my coalition, my tribe, that will help demonize those and the others. And if I'm, in fact, a steadfast warrior for the cause, I could rise in status regardless of the veracity of the belief. And when it comes to not political, but still largely beliefs that were untestable for most of human history, why do bad things happen to good people? What's the origin of misfortune, like plagues and earthquakes and famines? What was the origin of the universe? These cosmic questions, I don't think we naturally think of as matters that can be true or false, because our mind evolved in a world where you couldn't test them. And so all we had were good stories. People believed them because they were entertaining, because they expressed who they wanted to be, because they allowed the tribe to coalesce around some founding myths. Since the Enlightenment, we have the, at least historically, rather eccentric notion that all our beliefs should be grounded in reality. Bertrand Russell said it is undesirable to believe a proposition when there are no grounds whatsoever for believing it to be true. And that might strike us as banal or trite or obvious, but in fact it's a revolutionary manifesto, and most people have not signed on to it. So if you believe that that Hillary Clinton ran a pedophilia ring out of the basement of a pizzeria, whether she really did or not is not the reason you hold the belief. You hold the belief as a way of saying, "Boo, Hillary," or of saying, that's the kind of thing that she would be capable of, whether or not she did it. She is so decadent and corrupt and perfidious that I wouldn't put it past her to do that. So I'm going to say that she did it. Now, those of us who say, well, no, that shouldn't really be the basis of belief. You should only believe things that are true, not things that ratify some conviction in your coalition. Well, there's a sense in which we're the weird ones in the context of human history. Now, I think we're right. I think Bertrand Russell was right. It is undesirable to believe a proposition when there are no grounds for supposing that it's true. But that is a lesson that has to be pushed and reinforced and inculcated.
Do you think there really is an epidemic of fake news and conspiracy theories? You've mentioned one there. Or is social media simply sort of exaggerating it because we can see it in front of our eyes, whereas perhaps these ideas and this human nature towards confirmation bias and towards believing things that logically aren't true, but we want to believe them because they confirm our own opinions, that's been around for the entirety of human existence. So this idea that there's a pandemic of fake news or conspiracy theories perhaps is simply exaggerated by a tiny minority of very loud people on Twitter and Facebook and everything else.
Indeed. Now, it's not a tiny minority. That probably 9 out of 10 Americans believe in some conspiracy theory. Not necessarily QAnon, popular in the right, but there are left-wing conspiracy theories. There are many people who believe that HIV was a engineered virus dispersed by the CIA to control the black population. You call white supremacy something of a conspiracy theory, that all racial disparities are the result of people who want there to be racial disparities. And throughout history, there have been conspiracy theories, some of them quite destructive, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, like the Illuminati. Many pogroms and ethnic riots were triggered by some viral rumor about that members of that group killing an innocent of the majority group. Likewise, fake news. It's probably again, when it comes to people's everyday lives, where we have to know what's true or what's false, because reality is, as Philip K. Dick said, what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. But when it comes to things that are outside your realm of concrete physical experience, fake news might be closer to the rule rather than the exception. And it took journalism a lot of self-scrutiny, a lot of reform, a lot of adoption of codes of ethics and journalism schools and best practices for journalism not to be a conduit of fake news. And 19th century papers were full of nonsense, of sightings of sea monsters and civilizations on Mars. And so it's, and measures, people who have tried to apply a constant yardstick to conspiracy theorizing through the ages have not found a recent uptick.
I think there's a danger that there is a moral panic here, and I think that there could be serious consequences to that. For example, I'll give you two consequences. The first, censorship, that's the obvious one. Social media companies, big tech companies, during the last presidential election, censored a story, for example, about Hunter Biden's laptop. Now, we don't know whether the laptop was verifiable or whatever. The story was out there. You can make your own mind up about that. It was on the New York Post, one of the oldest, I think the oldest newspaper in America. This was a mainstream organization publishing this, and Twitter completely removed it from the internet. Facebook likewise did the same thing for temporarily and then put it back up. The second consequence is viewing your political opponents as stupid and idiots. And in the United Kingdom, after the Brexit referendum, you saw people on the other side of that referendum saying, well, Brexiteers, they didn't know what they were voting for. They were told lies by politicians. These people were stupid, thick Northerners, voters, who voted for this, and therefore we should reverse the result or have another referendum, which, you know, lots of people were saying this is completely anti-democratic, and how could you possibly say that, and how can you be so patronizing? So by spreading this idea that we live in an age of fake news, or we live in an age of conspiracy theories, you may be furthering censorship, and I think you are demeaning, or there is a possibility that you start demeaning your political opponents as thick and stupid when they're not necessarily.
I mean, I agree that that's a danger, and that there is something of a moral panic. Fake news in particular probably had a trivial role in the 2016 election. It mainly went to partisans, and it mainly titillated them with claims that kind of reinforced their conception of the worst of their opponents. It probably changed very few minds, and it was a tiny fraction of internet traffic. There is a danger that these social media companies will do the expedient thing and just shut down various kinds of controversial positions under pressure from both sides, because, of course, with the removal of Trump from Twitter, the social media became a bête noire of the American right and tried to regulate it. In the case of Trump on Twitter, it is slightly different in that just as in traditional free speech jurisprudence, there often is an exception carved out for incitement to imminent lawless activity or exhortation of violence, particularly violence against the democratic process. And so I think Twitter could have had a line that they could have, I think, justifiably said that Trump crossed, that you may not use our platform to tell people to be violent, in particular to violently disrupt the democratic process. But it is also true that some of the other kinds of suppression may be a response to a moral panic.
Twitter is, of course, a private company, but it has immense power in the public debate and public discourse. Likewise, Facebook. Some people would argue these are oligopolies. It's very difficult to start competition to these companies. They did actually try that on the right with the company called Parler.
Oh, yes.
It was pulled completely from the App Store, the Apple App Store, Google, because of these same accusations that there were people there spreading fake news and disinformation. Well, of course, on Facebook, there are people spreading fake news and disinformation all the time, but that company is allowed to stay up on the App Store and everything else. So the idea that this is simply just a private company may be limited in the fact that it may be a monopoly or an oligopoly. I also want to talk about this, and you can comment on that, but just also on conspiracy theories themselves, why they spread, and the history of conspiracy theories. There are some conspiracy theories that turn out to be completely true. You know, you can think of MK Ultra or Operation Paperclip or all these other things, and you can say actually, they might be true, and B, there might be a grain of truth within them. So this causes other problems, doesn't it? Because the truth isn't an obvious thing. There isn't just a simple line, this is true and this is not true. Sometimes it's more murky than that, and information isn't clear, and sometimes there are vested interests who are hiding some information. The government may not be completely honest. Obviously, the government isn't completely honest about everything.
Yeah.
So this creates huge problems, doesn't it, when you're trying to arbitrate social media platforms and other areas of public discourse, including going to universities and speaking and things like that, where there's no clear line here, and there are subjective analysis of for example, what Donald Trump said.
Well, there are a number of issues. So we being mortal humans, we will always, in fact, be uncertain about the objective truth. It still doesn't absolve us of having to come down and make decisions in particular cases, you know, as the Telegraph does, in deciding what news items to publish or not, depending on their degree of confidence in its veracity. Now, social media platforms notoriously are different from journalistic outlets in that they have operated closer to the telephone company or the post office than to a journalistic outlet, and have been, in U.S. law, held not liable for user-posted content, controversially. So we haven't yet, I think, settled on what is a defensible policy for social media. Are they, and as you know, there are debates on all of the issues that you brought up, like, are they really an unassailable monopoly that has taken such advantage of network effects that they're in effect dislodgeable? Or is Facebook now as perhaps vulnerable as MySpace was 15 years ago? In fact, the popularity of Facebook is declining. Could the market, including the marketplace of ideas, punish companies that are too restrictive, and could upstarts make inroads as they have in the past and with other so-called monopolies? Anyway, that's the whole discussion, a whole set of issues on what really is a monopoly and how unassailable a monopoly is, particularly in this zone. But then there are, just to repeat, I think if there are any carve-outs to speech at all, where exactly the boundary is, whether a particular instance will fall on one side or another, is inevitably will involve some decision-making under uncertainty. That is, you can't be certain. Nonetheless, you do have to make a decision. I do have a chapter in the book on statistical decision theory, namely, given that we have uncertainty, which we always have because we are mortals, given that there are consequences to errors in both directions, to false positives and false negatives, where should a cutoff be placed to give us the best outcome given the costs of errors in both directions? Now, of course, ideally we should minimize both kinds of error by making our signal of reality as noise-free as possible. That is, in the case of the courtroom, better forensics. In the case of journalism, digging deeper, verifying sources. In the case of science, more accurate instruments, better scrutiny against possible sources of error. That reduces all errors, but inevitably there'll have to be judgment calls. It's not exactly, or not necessarily subjective in the sense it's just a matter of taste, although it may be uncertain in that we don't know what the
or maybe a matter of interpretation.
And maybe a matter of interpretation. But I think it could be viable. That is, the policy that social media companies are obligated to allow anything to be disseminated, or else they become kind of clumsy censors of anything that might be a bit contentious, and they become so litigation shy that if it's controversial, they err on the side of shutting it down. I think there could be a middle ground, kind of maybe taking a leaf out of free speech jurisprudence, where there can be some legitimate kinds of speech that may be policed. Obviously, there must be, or there could not be a crime of bribery or extortion or blackmail, because those, by their very definition, involve speech. So if blackmail is a crime, we've got to be able to punish speech. And so carve-outs for particular categories, such as inciting an ethnic riot or a pogrom or a genocide, I can see that Facebook might say, well, we allow a lot of stuff on our platform, but not that. And then there, as always, there will have to be judgment calls, because there could be gray areas, but that doesn't absolve them of the requirement of making those judgment calls, and perhaps sometimes controversially.
Let's talk about one of those grey areas, and you talk about anti-vaxxers. Now, that isn't in itself a grey area, in my opinion, but I think that science itself, as people have come to describe it, isn't necessarily as clear-cut as I think that politicians and other media commentators are making it out to be. So, I'll give you an example. In the UK, Matt Hancock, our old health secretary, he would talk about it's right that we follow the science. He says that we need science on our side when tackling the coronavirus pandemic. Now, scientists massively disagree in some areas of the coronavirus pandemic. So some say, well, lockdowns don't work, some say they do. There's a huge debate here, and there isn't, saying the science is a very far too direct and allows for no nuance. There is an issue here, isn't there, that people are using this term, the science, and using science in a way that is not accurate. Science isn't as clear-cut as people are trying to make it out to be. What do you make of the idea that science is being used to censor people?
I don't know if science is being used to censor people, but science is being, invoked as a justification for censoring people. So I think there is that danger, absolutely, because to portray scientists as kind of priests or oracles who ought to be trusted because they have a direct access to the truth is a mischaracterization of what science is, and it ultimately does science harm, because it's just built into the process of science that there will be mistakes. One scientist said the whole point of science is to make mistakes as rapidly as possible so we could see what the mistakes are. Karl Popper, to bring him up again, characterized science as a process of conjecture and refutation. Namely, you want to broach hypotheses that could be falsified, and then some of them will be, and that's the way we approach the truth. And the fact that scientists change their mind indeed should not be taken as an indictment of science, which it is if you portray science as just another source of authority, as a kind of secular priesthood. Then when they're wrong, it's like, well, let's find yet another set of priests. The point of science is to allow necessarily fallible humans to grope their way toward the truth. And I do think that both scientists and the public health officials who allude to the science should both be more open in the reasoning that lead to their recommendations, and more open, perhaps open isn't the right word, because perhaps it hasn't occurred to them in the first place, that all decisions involve trade-offs of costs and benefits, and to justify it in terms of cost-benefit analysis given the uncertainty. This goes back to the chapter on statistical decision theory in rationality, that given say in the early stage of the pandemic, that no one knew whether lockdowns would work or not. And I agree, it's essential to concede that we did not know. It would have been legitimate to say we don't yet know whether they work or not. If we imposed them and were wrong that they were unnecessary, we would have had some economic costs, but perhaps saved lives. If we were wrong that not having lockdowns would lead to an explosion of the pandemic, that would be a much worse cost. So we are going to recommend the policy of being overcautious because the cost of being wrong is worse in the other direction. They were not honest in that way, perhaps because they themselves did not think in those terms, and they rather had the bureaucrat's mindset of when in doubt, ban it, cover your anatomy, better that it not be blamed on you.
I think I have another explanation to that links back to your book. I think that public officials and government officials believe that human beings are irrational, and that to tell them a white lie that lockdowns are fantastic and definitely work and we must do it, and that this is the science and we must follow it, was a simple way of saying to people, you need to comply. And if we were honest with them and said, we don't know, they probably suspected that people wouldn't make a rational decision to comply with the lockdown and to understand that there is actually a debate around these things.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there is an underestimation of people's capacity for rationality, and hence a kind of paternalistic condescension. We're going to pretend that we are infallible priests, because if we admitted our own fallibility, then people wouldn't trust us at all. Whereas that may be the exact opposite of the reality, and that the greater transparency would have been more effective in the long run. I suspect you're right.
When it comes to these kind of murky areas of truth, for example, lockdowns or the other subjects that we've touched upon where social media has been regulating and censoring people, where it's not so clear cut. I mean, you talk about terrorism and people inciting terrorism or violence. I think that's pretty obvious for Facebook to ban. But when it comes to the more subjective areas, isn't a better solution, rather than censorship, to have more transparency, to have more debate? And when you get, for example, an anti-vaxxer, shouldn't they be able to air their views and say, well, this is what I believe, and the truth will eventually win? And if you put light on a debate, if you put light onto the truth, then people will make a rational decision and decide that's the right thing.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Exactly.
Was the quote from, I think it was Louis Brandeis. I mean, in general, I agree with that the solution to speech is more speech. One can imagine, again, in America we call it a First Amendment advocate, but more generally free speech advocate. I think that we can have discussions of whether there are special, limited, unusual carve-outs, temporary. And just as I'm against laws that criminalize Holocaust denial, even though I think that it's an evil thing to promulgate, but I don't think the government in general should be in the business of policing it. But one could even imagine, say, in the aftermath of World War II in Germany, a temporary restriction that had a defined instrumental purpose, but that was not allowed to remain in place as an abridgment of speech. And one can imagine emergency measures where even agreeing that in the fullness of time we'll get to the bottom of it, but there is imminent danger now of spreading what we're almost certain is falsehoods, and that could lead to identifiable harm now, not serving as a precedent for suppressing speech indefinitely. I could imagine that in a private context of a social media company as being a defensible policy. That is, there is some degree of responsibility where the social media companies might say, we just don't want to be, we're private companies, we can do what we want, and we don't want to be complicit in that right now. Again, defensibly, if it was limited, circumscribed to a particular purpose.
Let's very briefly, because we haven't got much time left, talk about universities. And I know you mentioned in your book that there are problems within universities of intellectual debate being shut down, of the overwhelming majority of faculty being on the left, basically, and this can create groupthink and irrational outcomes. How significant is this problem in America and in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I think it is significant for two reasons. One of them is that by having a intellectual monoculture, we could cut ourselves off from the universe of ideas. There may be many true ideas that are never entertained because there's no one there to entertain them. There's the danger that if potentially true ideas are broached, they'll never get to be considered because those making them are punished. There's a danger that a whole class of people, possibly representing either a significant minority or the majority, are cut out of this which ought to be an incubator of ideas and education, and the very real possibility that the credibility of the university and of science will be sapped by people correctly sensing that heterodox ideas are punished and therefore having no confidence even when the ideas are justified. And I have had people ask me the question, well, why should we be impressed that there is a scientific consensus that human activity is warming the planet if it comes out of universities where everyone knows that if you have an unorthodox belief, you'll be canceled? Now, I don't happen to believe that that has happened with human-made climate change, but it does corrode the credibility on which the acceptance of scientific results depends.
Skepticism, debate, challenging orthodoxy, critical thinking, all of these things are surely lacking at the moment within our intellectual public spaces. Do you think that wokeism or identity politics is itself irrational?
Well, I think it's some aspects of it are, yeah. The fact that certain ideas are just considered taboo and therefore may not be entertained is a disabling of one of the main mechanisms for approaching the truth. So if certain thoughts can't be thought, that's irrational because it doesn't open the door to correction of mistaken beliefs and punishing of heretics. Then there may be tenets that are factually mistaken. I wouldn't call them irrational in that many factual propositions might be rational in the sense that there could be evidence for them, which then turns out to be superseded by better evidence in the other direction. So I wouldn't equate being mistaken with being irrational.
So you might think there's a gender pay gap, but there are actually 10 other reasons why the gender pay gap exists, and it's not just about sexism, for example.
Yes, so I think that the claim that it is due to sexism is not inherently irrational. The firing anyone who raises the possibility that it might be something other than sexism, that would be irrational.
On that note, Stephen, I know we've got to end. Thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely fantastic and interesting.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for the conversation.